I think the time that I realized what I had always wanted to do was really coming to fruition. Where, okay, I'm joining the big time now. This isn't just I'm just not just making records. Something big is about to happen. That came along when the album for Hall & Oates had been mixed, and I got called to do the single, to remix the single for radio, for R&B radio. And the song was called No Can Do. When that song became huge and it was on the radio everywhere, and it was my mix as opposed to the album mix, I could feel the difference. Something had happened now. I go, all of this, to try and mix this song, it was a very difficult song to mix just by the way it was recorded. There was just very little to work with. So I had to become very, very creative. So I think No Can Do, between that and Never Too Much, who had just come out also, that I had recorded and mixed, officially my first record that I'd done everything on it, was just an exciting time for me. I thought, okay, I'm not looking back here. I picked the right job. I started at Media Sound. I was originally a drummer in a band, traveling all over the States, and it just got to be a life that I didn't like. What I'd liked doing about it was when I was recording my band, recording the rehearsals. I thought, well, maybe this is more of a direction that I'd like to go in. And I got a job at Media Sound, and I just worked all day and all night, every day. That's all I did. This was a very well-known R&B studio. It came along that Luther Vandross was singing for a band called Change. And so I did the Change record. It was one of my first hits. There were two songs that I did on that record. It was Glow of Love and Searching. And when it came to him doing his solo record, he called me for that. And so that got the ball rolling. And so it wasn't long before we were doing Aretha and Dionne Warwick. It was just a great experience. And that really started breaking ground for me with my being known as an R&B engineer. It's pretty much every 4 or 5 years, I like to change style of what I do. And it was about 5 or 6 years later where I started to really move into something a little bit more rock. And that's where I got the Rolling Stones gig, Steel Wheels. And that was at the point too where, I was still engineering and mixing and it was at that point where with the Stones, all I did was mix the record. And I noticed that for me, mixing was the most fun of the whole process. So I found myself doing more and more mixing, especially in England. I always loved the British sound because I grew up on that. So the record labels loved what I did because I maintained the integrity of the British sound, but I gave them the American bottom end. Then came back and, 4 or 5 years go by again, and my first big pop record, well, there was a few, but the one that really, really made a definition of the kind of things that I do, the delays and the openness, was New Radicals, You Get What You Give. And that really broke out the pop. You move on for another 4 or 5 years, and there's Coldplay in 2001, which I went out to do 3 of their records, X and Y and Viva La Vida and Parachutes. And I almost did a full circle with John Mayer, because when I mixed John, it was back to the old R&B days, really, because he was the first R&B musician I had mixed in years that felt the way I felt about when I was working with Luther and funk bands and stuff like that. Just real soulful, real truly soulful artists. And I started thinking, okay, maybe it's time to do something even more ambitious A little more risky though, and that would be to really go into more indie music, because there's a lot of bands in Brooklyn that were really incredible bands. But indies comes with indie budgets, but I really wanted to mix a couple of these bands, Grizzly Bear being one of them, Twin Shadows being another, and so that opened up a whole new, avenue for me, on which I've just found a lot of pleasure in, because it's now exciting every day, and I get used to thinking in that approach, and so that's those. I think in a nutshell, those are the highlights. But it also is an example of the importance to always adapt as a mixer to the times as they change, and not to sit too happily in one style or in one place. When I came to Media Sound, quickly on, two people took me under their wing. First, Michael DeLug, who was a king of MOR at the time. He'd been doing Manilow and Smoking in the Boys Room, and just a lot of records. And his style, it was from him that I learned compression, understood the concept of compression. And then there was Harvey Goldberg. They were 180 degrees different by the way they worked in the studio, their approach, their mentality, how they dealt with clients, completely different. So I couldn't have gotten a better blend of two ways to look at the same thing. With Michael and his use of compression, I didn't even hear compression for the first year or two. I didn't know what he was doing, but it sounded good. But I couldn't hear the difference from one compressor or another compressor, which was obviously a bit disconcerting. But I didn't really tell anybody. I just kept asking and trying to figure out what these things do. Why, I just didn't have any of that connected yet. Then there were other people there, like Clear Mountain, who was just incredible. I worked with him often, but I wasn't his main guy. He had other guys. But when I did get to work with him, it was incredible to watch him. The senior guy was Fred Christie, who really I learned the most from. He was the senior, and he was like the Papa Bear, for all of us. And he watched over me carefully and really helped me mentally, his approach. You're a kid, you get a little cocky when things are going well. He knew how to redirect that. I love that man. He was just brilliant. And there was Joe Jorgenson. And he could get up a mix and a sound in under 10 minutes. It was unbelievable to watch this guy. And nothing bothered him. The tape could have, snapped, and the client would never know. He was just Mr. Cool. And again, I learned so much from him. And Alan Varner, I remember one time he was mixing a song, and I'm listening, I'm like, God, it feels so incredibly good. I'd never been that emotionally impacted by a mix, and of course I was sitting behind him, so I was watching the transition. Like, it was a mix, and then suddenly it was a record. I was like, oh. So there's that point where suddenly something happens, and now it's a record. And Alan would do that. And Harvey, and of course, Michael. But I think in my memory of so many years ago, I think the first time that hit me was with Alan Varner. So they were a big influence within the studio. And I only lived with the sound within the studio. I didn't even listen to outside records. I was so intimidated by the idea that there was so many other people that were so great that if I started listening to other records, I wouldn't want to do my job anymore. I mean, I was that insecure. And so all I did was I would record my records and I would listen to them. And then I'd record another and I would listen to them. And I'd only listen to my collection. So I was kind of developing my own sound, but also because I was afraid to hear. I mean, you can't help but listen to other records when you're in a cab, when you're walking down the street, when you're in a club. Okay, that's fine. I was okay with that, but I was frightened to hear a record where I just go, oh my God, I'll never be that good. Because it was already intimidating enough to hear Clear Mountain's records, you know, and to hear Harvey had done Tainted Love, you know, and I mean, you listen to these guys and I just feel like, okay, don't get depressed. If you're half as good as these guys, at least you'll be successful. I mean, that was the only way I could keep from just having a meltdown, because they were so on another level, these guys, right?